Lots of, yeah.
In New Jersey, makes mead. I did. It's a good spot, and
So you're New Jersey's first and only meadery, so we are the best and the worst. That's the story. But just like a little update since the last time I've been here, we've definitely brought home some awards over the years. Our second year, we entered the biggest mead competition in the world, the Meads Cup International out of Colorado. This is the biggest stage for mead in the world. Last year, we brought home 5 medals, which is pretty cool because no meadery in the world has ever won more than 5 medals at that competition. Up until this past March, when we broke that record and brought home 7 medals this year. So we're not only the world's most award-winning meadery, but at the biggest competition in the world. So that was really cool. And we're in the back of a mall in New Jersey. That's that is the best part. Yeah. We could have been more Jersey if we were in the back of a diner, but we found a space in the back of the mall. But yeah, so basically, for those who don't know, we make a little bit of everything. We focus mainly since day one on like your standard strength meads, your 12 to 14% alcohol stuff. We do make some dry, off-dry, semi-sweet, sweet, kind of go all over the board, try to make something for everybody. And essentially, at the end of the day, I still kind of feel like I'm a home brewer, just at a much larger scale. We're constantly experimenting, new flavor combinations, new honey varietals, you name it. In 3 years, we literally just celebrated 3 years since we opened our doors for business last week. In 3 years, we released, I think, 48 different meads. And I think we have another 6 or 8 that we're going to be releasing before the end of this year. So I mean, in 3 years, we released quite a few, quite a nice selection, if you would. So we've definitely learned a few things here and there, what to do, what not to do, and what works, what doesn't work. And now we've even started focusing a lot on some session meads, some more low alcohol draft meads that we can drink instead of just drinking beer all the time like we do at the meadery. Which goes in line with the quote that goes, it takes a lot of great beer to make great wine. If you drink wine all day, you'd be shit-faced, basically. So we started making a lot of more session meads in-house, and then we started putting them on draft for ourselves and for customers. And then we we bought 2 30-barrel unit tanks, so now we're actually packaging that and selling those kegs throughout Jersey and New York as well. So that's kind of like the new side product line, I guess, that we've been working on right now. So kind of like all over the board, do a little bit of everything. But as far as mead making goes, how many people have actually made mead here before? A few. All right. So as far as making mead, I think I'll just kind of generalize some general mead making tips essentially, and then I'll kind of open it up to whatever else you guys want to learn or ask me, I guess. But as far as making mead, a lot of brewers I would always hear them say like, oh, making mead is easy. You add honey and water together, pitch your yeast, and you're done, right? It's like making Jell-O. Pretty much, more or less, yeah. That's as easy as it is to make mead. Making good mead is a whole different story. So basically, there's 3 different pillars that I think that are essential to a really great mead. I think number 1 on that list is definitely ingredients. So you want to get the best honey you can get and the best water that you can get. So as far as the honey, if you buy direct from a beekeeper locally, that's the freshest honey, the best honey you can get your hands on. You could also buy from a True Source certified honey supplier, such as Dutch Gold Honey in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. They're where we get most of our honey, at least 90% of our honey comes from them. And they're a True Source certified honey supplier, which basically just ensures us that none of that honey was adulterated in any way, like back with corn syrup or anything like that. It's a pretty rigorous certification process for them to be a True Source certified honey supplier. In fact, they can track all the honey that they sell all the way back to the hives that it came from. It's pretty crazy, but we get really great high quality honey and lots of different honey varietals, all from one supplier. So they also sell in smaller containers, not just in bulk. So if you go on DutchGoldHoney.com, you guys can actually buy the same exact honey that we use at the meadery to make our mead. So The coolest part is they source different honey varietals from beekeepers and apiaries all over the world. Mainly obviously the U.S., but even some from South America and a little bit from Canada. So basically, we get lots of different honey varietals anytime we want, which is the best thing in the world. We get orange blossom, clover honey, buckwheat honey, wildflower.
How do you get the bees just to go for the orange blossoms?
So we don't do anything. The beekeepers, though, will take their hives. Let's say you want orange blossom honey, they'll take their hives to the citrus groves down in Florida or out in California, right before the orange blossoms are about to bloom. And as soon as they bloom, basically all the bees go and collect the closest nectar source to the hives. And they like to stick to the same nectar source. So if you ever see like a honeybee in a park and you have different flowers growing on the ground, you'll see that they'll actually stick to that same floral source and fly over different flowers just to stick with that same nectar source that they're collecting. It's pretty cool. So essentially with that much acreage, especially of orange groves, you're pretty well, you can be pretty sure that at least 90% of that honey, that nectar rather, coming back to the hives is going to be from orange blossoms. Now you have orange blossom honey. You do the same thing with clover fields and so on and so forth. So basically, yeah, lots of different honey varietals at our fingertips. If you stick just with traditional mead making, which is just honey and water, I mean, just a different honey varietal is going to give you a whole different final product. And then you got yeast selection and fermentation temperature as well with each individual yeast strain that you can play around with. So the possibilities are pretty much endless. It's not as simple as just honey and water, and not as simple as expecting it to always, no matter what honey or yeast or fermentation temperature you choose, it's never going to come out exactly the same, depending on what you do. So ingredients in, quality in, as far as ingredients goes, quality out. So the best honey is definitely essential, number one on the list. As far as the water goes, on the ingredient side of things, you can kind of use, as long as if it's water that you would drink, it's okay to make mead. I would just stay away from extremely hard water. That's kind of like the only type of water that I would say is not that great for mead making.
Why not?
It's just way too, you're just going to get way too low minerally content. It's just too much. You want definitely more of a softer profile. You're not going for anything sharp or anything on the final product necessarily. You want to kind of stick with the softer water profile. So at the meadery, we're the only meadery that I know of that uses reverse osmosis water for all of our mead making. We don't add any salts or anything back to the water. We just leave that water alone. We add our honey into it. We add our nutrients during the fermentation process, but that's it. No kind of brewing salts or water adjustments at all. So there's people out there that'll say to not use reverse osmosis water or not use distilled water. Everybody has their own opinions, but I remember there was one big thread on one of the media groups on social media on Facebook, and one of the guys, well, a lot of people were actually saying, stay away from RO water, stay away from distilled water. And then I pop in and I say, absolutely, stay away from it. That's all we use at Melovino, and we only won 7 medals at the Major Cup International. You can use RO water, distilled water, it's totally fine. So I'm not sure why people are so against it, but anyway.
Well, I mean, we think we get a lot of the yeast nutrients out of malt, and you're not adding malt. Where all the yeast nutrients come from?
Exactly, which comes to my second pillar of like good mead making is nutrients, right? So yeah, in brewing, you're essentially getting all the nutrients that the yeasts are going to need for a healthy fermentation from the malt during the mashing process. So with honey and mead, one of the most important nutrients that the yeast are going to require is nitrogen. The biggest deficiency that honey has as far as nutrients is nitrogen. It almost has close to 0 nitrogen. So in a healthy fermentation where you're looking at the very, very least 100, mainly really 150 to 200 parts per million of nitrogen, your average batch of mead is going to give you roughly on the highest end about 30 parts per million. That's using like the darkest honey you can get your hands on. Darker honey has more nitrogen content naturally, but most of the time you're not going to be using super dark honey like buckwheat honey. Buckwheat honey if you ever smell or tasted buckwheat honey, it essentially smells and tastes like a petting zoo or a horse's ass. Zero exaggeration. But it could be used in mead making. It's just going to take you a long, long time to get rid of that. But yeah, even on the highest end of 30 parts per million, you're definitely going to be super deficient in how much nitrogen you would really want. So that's why back in the day, everybody had the whole thing with mead that it takes a year or two before mead is drinkable. And it would be, because the yeast would be unhappy during fermentation, be putting off a lot of malt flavors that you don't necessarily want. And it would take about a year or two for all that to age out. But now with nutrient additions that came into the mead making scene, let's say about 6 or 7 years ago, now you're talking about 3 to 4 months turnaround time on average for like your standard strength mead. So we're basically step feeding those nutrients during the first part of fermentation. Usually between the first 4 to 7 days, you're basically adding a little bit of nutrient on 4 times during that first week. And it's normally, if you do everything right, it's normally your first 4 days after you pitch your yeast. So we're basically adding nutrients in, different types of nutrients that people are using at home and on the commercial scene as far as adding nitrogen to your mead is Fermate K and DAP. Those are the two most used, especially for years. DAP is basically just diammonium phosphate, so which is called a DAP for short. And Fermate K. Most of the time, a lot of people are using Fermate K and DAP jointly in the mead making process, but we use a different product. We use a product called Fermate O, which biggest difference between Fermate O and the others is Fermate K and DAP contain nitrogen in an inorganic source of nitrogen, where Fermate O contains DAP as an organic form of nitrogen. Contains nitrogen in an organic form. So the biggest difference between those are the inorganic nitrogen. The yeast can't metabolize that nitrogen during the later parts of fermentation. So what will happen is, if you're not doing actual precise measurements and adding exactly how much nitrogen you need, or nutrients rather, if you go a cookie cutter approach to adding the same amount of those nutrients during the fermentation process for any mead you make, basically you're going to run into issues. We're going to have stalled fermentations or other off flavors. A lot of the times you get like some sulfury notes, like rotten egg sulfur coming out of your batch that you don't necessarily want, and that really all comes mainly from most of the time nutrient deficiency. So if you go with Fermate O though, everything that you're adding with Fermate O, all that organic nitrogen can be metabolized by the yeast throughout the entire fermentation process. So you're putting your yeast in a much happier spot. There's way less of a spike of fermentation rate during your process, so you're going to develop way cleaner flavors. It's not going to burn through and then just fall off completely during the fermentation. You have a nice, steady, and still quick fermentation. It's not going to take longer than having your fermentation just ramp up, either with Fermate K and DAP. So that's what we do. Fermate O as our nitrogen source, and we properly rehydrate our yeast with GoFirm, which is a great yeast energizer. And the rates that we add everything in, I'm not even going to try to get into the calculations and all the details on that verbally, but I did put up a website called meadmaderight.com, and I literally detailed exactly how we make everything as far as the nutrients and our yeast rehydration protocol goes at the meadery. So meadmaderight.com, it has all the details there. The third pillar is fermentation temperature. It all depends on the mead you're making too. We actually have a mead that I actually have here with me. I brought one bottle. We fermented it at 82 degrees, which is super, super high, especially for mead. Normally mead, preferably I would say ferment in your 60 to 64 degree area to get some really nice clean final product as young as possible, drinkable as young as possible. So 60 to 64 degrees is preferable. But we fermented this one in particular at like 80, 82 degrees. Won a gold medal at the biggest mead competition in the world. It doesn't necessarily make a bad mead. It's as long as there's a purpose to doing what you're doing, it could work or it cannot, right? But I wouldn't recommend that necessarily for every mead you make. But fermentation temperature, just like in the beer world, with ale yeast and lager yeast is going to give you way different final outcomes depending on that temperature. With mead making, lower is better, I believe, because you're talking way more alcohol. You're talking on average 12, 14, 16, 18% alcohol, depending on what you're making. And the higher that fermentation temperature is, the more fusel alcohols you're gonna produce in that mead. It's just gonna take you way longer to be able to actually enjoy opening a bottle of that mead. So the lower the better, 60, 64 degrees. So essentially those are like the three pillars of, I think, really great mead making. Those are the three things that we actually focus on the most, pay the most attention to at the meadery. And I mean, we're fermenting with these steps. We're basically fermenting 14% alcohol in about 6 to 7 days. We're getting 14% alcohol. Then we're filtering all of our mead, so we can actually fast forward the maturation process by filtering all the yeast out. Then we still allow it to age and mature for a little while, but it happens a little quicker after you do some really nice sterile filtration at least. You can make a 3-week-old mead taste like a 3-month-old mead when you do that. So that's what we do, and we're able to kind of turn around tanks a little faster if needed. Not that we really need to use full capacity of our tanks just yet, but we have all the room to grow that we want. And that's basically it, as general as I could basically put it without boring anybody to death. Any questions about anything as far as the mead making goes?
Have you noticed if any particular varieties of honey require more nutrient than others, or is it strictly the yeast that decides that?
So good question. So for the first part, the honey is not really going to determine anything. For the most part, it's always going to be super deficient. Like I said, even the darker honey varietals where you get the most nitrogen naturally in the honey, you're still super deficient on nitrogen. So basically, we go about it in a route where we just assume 0 nitrogen for every mead that we're making. Because, like I said, even on the highest end, if we used 100% super dark honey, which is not really going to give you the best mead anyway, so it's not what we would be doing. But even in that case, we'd only have about 30 parts per million on the highest end. So we always assume 0 for how much nitrogen we actually start with. As far as the yeast though, how much nitrogen you actually do need does also come into play with what yeast selection you're making. So there's some, normally you're using wine yeast to make mead. That's common practice, although some meaderies, well, very few, but some homebrewers and 1 or 2 meaderies that I know of actually specialize in using only ale yeast to ferment their meads. Produces a slightly different product, still good in its own right, but most of the time you're using wine yeast. Depending on that yeast strain, you either have a low, medium, or high nitrogen requirement. So basically what I kind of came up with, when I came up with like my nutrient regimen, we coined it TOSNA, which just stands for Tailored Organic Macronutrient Addition. We've actually updated it to TOSNA 2.0, where we basically take, we refine the actual amount of nitrogen levels that we need to a slightly lower amount, because we were basing all of our target nitrogen levels that we needed for mead making based upon an outdated paper and source. So we basically took those numbers, and that's what we built our nutrient regimen on. And then we actually adapted after we kind of realized we felt that we might be overfeeding. We might be adding more nutrients than we really need. So we did some homework, spoke to a lot of people that were smarter than us, particularly at Scott Laboratories. And they actually recommended we go to a slightly lower nitrogen level. And it all depends on the starting gravity of where you're going to start out for that batch. And then we also added in, depending on the actual, we tailor it even further with our TOSNA 2.0 with depending on the yeast selection as well. So there's actually factors that we can use depending on whether that yeast strain requires low, medium, or high nitrogen requirements. We tailor it even more based upon that. And ever since we've transitioned to this TOSNA 2.0, we've literally never had a failed batch of stalled fermentation or anything. So it's been pretty cool. A lot of homebrewers have adapted it. A lot of commercial meaderies have actually started adapting their protocols to using what we're doing now. Yeah.
What's the ideal temperature to
Depends on the mead, depends on your preference. I think a well-made mead can be had at any temperature. It's not like a warm, Coors Light or Corona. Anything that's made well can be had at any temperature and still tastes good. However, we put serving temperature suggestions on our bottles. So depending on the mead itself, like if it's a traditional mead, I prefer having that nice and chilled. It's just way more refreshing, a little bit crisper. Some of our darker meads, I prefer having them at room temperature, just because there's a lot more that you're going to get out at that higher temperature than if you just had it ice cold. So you're going to be missing out on a lot.
You think about them a little bit like you think about wine and wine temperatures?
Yeah, essentially, more or less, yeah. Pretty close to that. Yeah. So it really all depends. Then you got like your draft meads, your session meads. I mean, those, nice and cold in a pint glass, all day long. Yeah.
Sergio, you do a lot with fruits, you do a lot with all that. Does it all go in the beginning, or do you start the honey and then add the fruit later?
Yeah. Anytime we use fruit, we add everything in primary. So obviously when we're using fruit, we can back off the honey a little bit because we're getting additional sugars from the fruit. But because we do that, that's why we do that. But every time we do use fruit, we do it in primary. We ferment it together with the honey. I kind of feel like it just gives you more of an integrated flavor. Now it tastes like a raspberry mead rather than a raspberry flavored mead. You know what I mean? It's, there's some mead makers that'll do that. They make like big, base recipes, like they have a semi-sweet and a sweet mead base recipe, and then they just flavor it different ways at the end with fruits or spices or both. Most of our recipes are like their own batch. Even kind of similar style recipes are their own separate batch.
Everything up front, fermented out.
Yeah. There's very, very few meads that we actually do like a base recipe and then do spin-offs. But even when we do that, we make sure that they are as different as possible from one another. Because to me, there is one meadery that's all they do. They have two base recipes and they just flavor everything after fermentation. And it's super boring when you're tasting their portfolio of meads, just because it's all, you can just tell they're all the same mead, just flavors slightly different, Yeah.
So I have like two questions. First one, he was talking about that with the fruits. Do you use the formula to reduce the honey you need when adding the fruit?
Yeah.
Okay. And how many the average per pounds per fruit used per gallon of
That's tough to say, because we don't use a lot of whole fruit. When we do whole fruit, we do our smallest tank sizes are like 80 gallons. So when we do our whole fruit, we do in those tanks just because it's way easier to manage. All of our other tanks are our biggest tanks, we have 3 that are like 1,100 gallon tanks. So we don't have man-weight doors on those. So unless we threw somebody into the tank to shovel all that fruit out at the end, that's the only way we'd be able to do that. But so instead, we use mainly fruit juices or fruit juice concentrates. We get way more tank yield, and it's way easier for us to calculate exactly how much sugar we're getting from everything, which kind of led me to, instead of calculating and formulating all our recipes based upon how many pounds of fruit per gallon, I started developing all my recipes based off of how much percentage of sugar I want from this fruit or that fruit or